is the DeFi Decoded podcast by 9 Point Partners. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of DeFi Decoded. I am Alex Tapscott. Andrew Young is out today. Today we have a terrific guest, Sarah Milby, the head of policy at the Blockchain Association. The Blockchain Association is the leading nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting a pro-innovation policy environment for the digital asset economy. It was founded in 2018. Before that, there were several organizations that were advocating on behalf of the industry and trying to build bridges in Washington, D.C. and other capitals around the world. But I really think that the Blockchain Association has helped to really crystallize that mission and has also been quite effective. There are several people within the organization that have become some of the leading voices in the US and elsewhere advocating for that pro-innovation policy. We're very fortunate today to have Sarah, who is one of those people and one of those leading voices. Sarah leads the development and implementation of policy decisions on behalf of the association. She joined the association in the summer of 2020 and currently heads that policy department. Sarah and her team provide members with deep policy analysis on proposed legislation and regulatory actions. And she has been a featured speaker at some major industry conferences where her opinion has been valued. Her opinion pieces have also been published in national outlets. She's a graduate of the University of Chicago, magna cum laude as a member of Phi Beta Kappa, and earned honors in her major. And Sarah is in London, England at the moment, just got off an airplane, but is with us here today. So we're very delighted to be speaking with you. So Sarah, maybe before we dig into several big topics, this is an election year, for example, and there are major regulatory questions that are outstanding and are becoming more urgent, both in the U.S. and around the world. Let's talk a little bit about the Blockchain Association. What is the origin of that organization? What problem did it seek to solve? And tell me a little bit about the progress that's been made so far.
Yeah, and thanks again for having me, Alex. I'm happy to be joining you guys today. A little bit of background about BA, Blockchain Association, we call it BA for short. It was founded in the fall of 2018 and had about, 15 or so founding member companies. DC has a long history of trade associations. Their advocacy groups usually have they're member-based organizations, so they'll have a number of companies who pay membership dues, and in return, they get advocacy and other types of policy regulatory help. So we provide those services to our members. We have about 100 member companies now, all ranging from investors to centralized exchanges, DeFi developers, et cetera. It kind of runs the gamut. But what they all have in particular is that they are crypto native companies and working on public blockchains. So we don't represent any kind of big bank that has a minority interest in the crypto space. They're all people who are very much invested in growing and developing the ecosystem.
Right.
Blockchain Association was formed really to help figure out the policy space for crypto. It's a very nascent space. It's still no big law. I mean, there's been one big law passed about crypto, but besides that, we're still operating in a lot of uncertainty. So we're trying to figure out how to navigate the uncertainty on behalf of our members and inform policymakers and regulators as they're making decisions on that impact the industry and how we'll move forward.
Terrific. And so you mentioned that there have been no new laws, but there have been a lot of actions taken by the government. And I think it may have been Kristen Smith, your CEO, who said that regulation by enforcement is a bad way of doing policy. And so far, it seems to be that is one of the main tools that certain regulatory agencies have used. And I kind of go back and forth on this because I agree with the sentiment that obviously, enforcement is a bad way to do regulation. And I think at this point, the industry is large enough, mature enough. Those 100 companies are, some of them are quite big and important and service millions of customers. But on the other hand, there's a track record in new industries of regulating too quickly before people kind of realize what's there, or adding sort of duplicate cost or adding additional work for companies, especially startups who are trying to scale. And there's an example of this even within the crypto industry with the BitLicense in New York, right, which is sort of a widely panned sort of early attempt to try and sort of create a regulatory framework for this industry. So tell us a little bit about, you mentioned in the pre-call discussion that you're in London at an event, and one of the themes is developing good or sensible policy around this asset class and around this technology. So broad strokes, what does that look like? What is good policy for this industry? And what are the specific aims, I guess, of the Blockchain Association?
Yeah, I think for us, one of the major hurdles we face is just education. I think so many policy decisions are trying to be made by people that don't fully understand the technology. And to be fair, it's a very difficult technology. I think there are a lot of ways that the industry works that's quite different from the traditional web and traditional financial infrastructure. For that reason, there are a lot of new considerations that must be in place when you are thinking of new ways to regulate. So, for instance, if you're looking at an asset and trying to put it into our current buckets of assets, like, is it a commodity? Is it a security? There are lots of questions, I think, about how our assets operate and their origin that is quite distinct and really requires a new sense of, like, a new framework and a new way of looking at things that I think regulators are having a hard time doing, and lawmakers for that matter. So on the agencies, you see a lot of folks trying to apply existing regulation like the SEC. I think this is where a lot of the regulation by enforcement comes in. They're saying a lot of these things seem like securities, whether or not you agree with that, but in their minds, that's how they're operating. And so they use their existing authority in order to bring enforcement actions, et cetera. Other agencies, I think, are taking a little bit of a fresher look at things. Like, I think the CFTC has been pretty open about it with okaying Bitcoin and ETH futures, for instance. But in general, I think there's a lot of uncertainty around exactly what types of tests you're going to put in place, and especially definitions. How you're defining things in the ecosystem is quite difficult. And honestly, the ecosystem changes so quickly. I think that's another really big hurdle that we face, is like every 2 years, there's some brand new term that no one could have imagined 2 years ago being used, or some crazy new way of computing and doing algorithms, et cetera. So we're trying to stay on top of that and make sure that the Hill and regulators can keep that in mind when they're approaching these kinds of decisions, because laws don't get made very often. And so it's important that they get them right when they do.
Yeah. Oh, completely. I mean, there are examples where the laws have been have gone the wrong way, right? I mean, I think the BitLicense is one that I think most people in the industry agree was not a good, not a thoughtful sort of law. But there are examples even from previous technologies. During the first era of the automobile, the government in London created a set of rules called red flag laws that basically required every car to have two people operating. There would be a driver, a coachman, and there'd be a red flag man. His job was to walk in front of the car waving a red flag. And the logic was that horses in particular would be startled by these new vehicles, these new things on the road. And they were pretty ungainly steam engine powered, devices. So they were quite disruptive. But the idea that you were trying to create a new law to fit sort of the old paradigm of transportation, kind of defeated the purpose of the car, which is to have autonomy and mobility and speed. And that, I think, some people credit with sort of slowing down automobile development in the UK at the time. And then in the 90s, they had, the Telecommunications Act came into place. And that was, broadly considered sort of the foundation for the commercialization of the web. But before that, a lot of people were really worried about the internet. In one case, someone was proposing that everybody who will launch a website get a CB radio license, because the idea was they're a broadcaster, right? You're broadcasting, you need to get a license. Your radio stations get licenses, websites should get licenses. That would have killed the commercial web, or at least put it on a completely different trajectory. And so now here we are. And I think people in the industry are kind of, jonesing for a grand sort of comprehensive policy that will achieve all of their aims and make some compromises where necessary. But it feels like that's not really likely. And I'm wondering, or at least not likely in the short term. And so I'm wondering, like, in the short term, is there any low-hanging fruit? Is there any sort of area where there's sort of a common understanding of the value? And I think one example of this would be stablecoins, right? US dollar stablecoins. So US dollar stablecoins are according to recent reports, have over 100 million users, which is more users than buy and sell crypto assets as investments. So the technology is being used as a payment rail, and it's being used by Americans, by people overseas, by people everywhere, really. And it seems like a really important and useful innovation and an implementation of this technology. And it's something that could, reduce friction for consumers and provide more choice and improve the metabolism of the economy and maybe help export the US dollar. Like all these things seem like things that people in the States should want, including people who are parts of different stakeholder groups. And I'm wondering, what's the latest on that? Because what I see is that we're not happy or something. People in the industry are not satisfied with the current state of affairs. Can you shine some light on this particular issue? Because it's something I find both fascinating. I think it'd be an important sort of first step. Like if we can get this right, maybe from there we can build around it a constellation of new laws and policies.
Yeah, definitely. And I totally agree. I think stablecoins is probably the easiest thing that can get done. And it's for a few reasons. The first being that it is a fairly centralized part of our ecosystem. So I think there's a lot of similarity there to existing traditional assets and how they've been regulated. So from that point of view, it's not like it takes an entirely novel set of laws in order to wrap your head around how to regulate it. Yeah. Additionally, from an education standpoint, it's pretty easy to explain to a member of Congress about, just imagine a digital dollar on a blockchain. They're like, okay, like I can kind of wrap my head around that, one-to-one, et cetera. Yeah. Whereas if you start trying to explain like a wrapped token or, other things, it just goes way over their heads. But from my perspective, I think a lot of the issues we've been seeing on the stablecoin front have been a matter of politics, not necessarily a matter of policy. And I think there's a very thin line between those two things. They often work in conjunction with each other. A lot of the policymaking, I think, gets done first, and then it's a matter of politics for when things come into fruition and will actually get passed into law. So I think right now,
right? Yeah, you got to make sure that there's a window that this is a priority that people care about politically. And that's something I want to ask too, which is like, do most Americans even have a view on this yet? We'll get to that after, but yeah, go ahead on the stablecoin.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting. I feel like there's a lot of politics right now around the stablecoin bill. Well, just passing a stablecoin bill in general, there's been a long history in the House Financial Services Committee from McHenry and Waters, who have each been like ranking member and leader of the committee different times in the last two Congresses. And they've been working on a stablecoin bill and just haven't been able to get anything across the finish line despite passing something out of committee last summer. Now we have a Lummis Gillibrand Payment Stablecoin Act that was just released 2 weeks ago, I think. Yeah. And this is a kind of interesting Senate version. And in the Senate version, I think they've been working very closely with the administration, Treasury, and the Fed, and trying to figure out where they're coming from on their policy priorities and things like that, and what is feasible and what's not feasible. It's an interesting dialogue between the administration and Congress right now. I think there's quite a bit of discussion there about working out details and things like that, and it's slowing a lot of the stablecoin bills down for that reason. I think there's a lot of strong arming and, well, I want this, you want that, and how can we get to a place we're all happy? But it seems like no one's really happy with how things have been turning out, which in turn, I think hurts its political viability.
What would you say is the main issue that people within the industry, your members, have with this bill, with the Senate version, I guess, which is the one that's the most recent and the one that people are talking about? Why are they not satisfied?
I think the biggest one is that there's an algorithmic stablecoin ban, just a blanket ban. And I think we're very big proponents of innovation and the idea that you can't foresee potential coming down the line that could totally revolutionize our space and efficiency, et cetera. We would prefer not to have any sort of ban on a specific type of technology, especially stuff that's like open source code, right? Like there's free right to speech in code in many instances. So
basically, just for our listeners, some of whom are not like crypto native. So, what they seem to be in support of are fully collateralized, centralized stable coins. So like USDC, where every dollar outstanding is backed 100% or perhaps even more by treasuries or some dollar denominated asset, right? What they don't want, I guess, is a blow up of similar to what happened with UST, right? And so their reaction is to say, let's just prevent any kind of stablecoin that might even have the same design or something even close to it, which, to your point, seems like an overreach. But you can understand their trepidation, I think, right? Given what has happened.
I can understand. And I think in general, to date, the government has been able to call someone when something goes wrong.
Right.
And that doesn't always exist in our industry. And even in existing payment stablecoin models like Circle, you can't always call Circle when something goes wrong in some random wallet overseas. Like they can do certain measures to freeze funds actually, but even that can get, I think, difficult depending on the law enforcement and interaction with them. So that's just to say that I think the crypto ecosystem is very particular in that it's decentralized, and that's part of the interest. I think the part that makes it interesting and exciting. And from a regulatory point of view, I think lawmakers would like to make it similar to what exists today in the traditional banking. And so a lot of the proposals, like this latest Senate bill, actually would basically make you need to be a bank in order to issue stable coins, and puts a lot of federal oversight over even a state pathway option, which I think is another concern for a lot of our members.
Well, the thing that, the central paradox or the conflict that exists is that the technology is global and it's decentralized. And the laws are meant to regulate companies that operate locally or can be overseen locally. And where the processes and the technology is decentralized. And this is especially true. I mean, it's true for all use cases, but stablecoins, only 1 billion people in the world can access a US dollar bank account. I'm a Canadian and I can do it. You're an American, you can do it. You're in Europe or Japan. I don't even know about Japan, but certain countries, you have access to this. But for the vast majority of people, having a way to conveniently store and move dollars was next to impossible until stablecoins came along. So there's like a clear product market fit for people who want to store value in dollars, especially if they live in a part of the world where the local currency is not particularly reliable, or maybe it's hard to open a bank account or get a full range of financial services. For these examples before, but at the same time, these regulations would probably limit the usefulness of stablecoins for those global use cases, because they don't know who's the person on the other side of the world using the US regulated stablecoin to send money to someone else who's not in the US, right? It's basically creating, my partner on our podcast, Andrew, describes Tether, for example, as sort of like a euro dollar. It's like this sort of like offshore dollar that's used between non-Americans, for various reasons. And I'm not sure that the rules reconcile that or even contemplate that. Or maybe they do and they're trying to stop that from happening. But if that's true, then that sort of defeats the purpose in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of trouble sometimes contemplating the effects that U.S. regulation, U.S. policy decisions have on people outside of our borders, and how actually implementing technologies that are borderless and enabling them to better facilitate payments abroad can help the dollar in the United States in turn. So I think there's a lot to be done there in terms of trying to educate policymakers on the impacts of their decisions. We're doing a lot in the privacy space on that, particularly around AML, for instance, anti-money laundering and know your customer regimes. Yeah, I think it's tough. I understand the U.S. government wanting to regulate its own currency. That's an understandable place for it to come from. It's just hard when you can't necessarily control developers in other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to turn our attention a little bit to politics. We've been talking about the policy side. So Coinbase is a company that I follow very closely, and listened to the conference call where Brian Armstrong basically laid out sort of priorities for the year. And he was talking about, the growth plans and being profitable in all markets and so forth. But one of the things that he mentioned as a key priority was basically supporting pro-crypto candidates going into the election. And it seems like this is maybe the first election where this is an issue that is where the technologies become widely dispersed and the asset class widely held, and maybe not, if not systemically important, like very relevant, that it's become an issue, right? It's become an issue for for people who are in the industry, who are building businesses, but also maybe for end users who want to make sure that, they continue to enjoy the benefits of it, or that it grows in a sustainable way. So can you talk a little bit about the political side of it? Like the Blockchain Association, how does it support its members, in an election year? And can you tell us a little bit just about where do you think we're at on the political side? Do you think that companies like Coinbase and others can use their clout and resources to actually have an influence in this way? And if so, how exactly?
Yeah, I think the politics side is interesting. For one reason, it's just I think it makes for strange bedfellows sometimes. Like it's not necessarily a partisan issue. There are
Yeah.
people who come together, whether they're very liberal Democrats and more conservative Republicans, they I think can share similar values. It does seem to be more generational, I think. I think younger members tend to understand it better. And so from the perspective of potential candidates, getting in fresh blood, people who understand the promise of innovation, who are more internet native, understand how individuals, especially young people, are using financial services these days can be very helpful. And so I think from that perspective, it could be really helpful and exciting to try to get in new candidates. But at the same time, I think one of our biggest missions is working with what we have in Congress and trying to figure out ways to make inroads with new members who might not be on a committee that have to deal with crypto so that, for instance, if a crypto bill does come to the floor, they are better informed and can ask better questions about the impact of that policy and the decision they make whether to pass the bill or not. In terms of like the federal states and the relationship there, it's been interesting too, like even from the stablecoin perspective. You were talking about the BitLicense earlier in New York, and that has a very strong stablecoin issuing regime. And you would expect someone like Senator Gillibrand, for instance, to try to protect that in a negotiation on a stablecoin bill. But
Right.
it's interesting how
she's a New York senator, right? So
exactly
in this case, this would be the political side kind of creeping into the policies.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
But we're Senator Lummis from Wyoming. Like they have lots of crypto banks in Wyoming. So being able to protect their ability potentially to issue stablecoins is another route that you would see potentially coming into fruition. But again, like politics can only go so far, and they're also competing interests. So it'll be interesting, I think, to see how this election plays out. And we have lobbyists on staff. I'm not a lobbyist. We have some on staff whose job it is to meet with different policymakers regularly and their staff and try to understand what the latest is and get insights so that, if someone's thinking about writing a crypto bill, hopefully we can give them some feedback on that bill before it's released or something like that to make sure they're not making any kind of fatal mistakes.
Yeah. 2 years ago, before FTX blew up, I was interviewing people for a book that I wrote recently called Web3. And a couple of people that I spoke to said that at the time, this was like maybe the summer of 2022, that blockchain or crypto was one of the few bipartisan issues. And what they meant was not that, there's broad support for it from members of Congress across the aisle, but that the people who were most interested in it and willing to help push it forward came from different parts of the political spectrum, right? And that was true both at the federal level, but also, at the state and local level, where governors and, even below that were interested in trying to figure out how their state could be competitive in this industry. And it seems like that's changed in the last 12 to 18 months. And, I think that partly it's because of the administration and people within it who are taking, more of a hard line approach. But it seems like, at least today, it's shifted from being something that was enjoyed by everyone or people from different parts to something that really seems like more partisan. So you said it's not a partisan issue from the voter standpoint, that it's more falls along age lines, young versus old. But what about politically today? Like, is it possible that this issue can become something that enjoys? I mean, Christian Gillibrand is a Democrat, so that's maybe an example of that. But beyond that, like in a general sense, is this something that can become bipartisan again?
I think so. I think it will be interesting to watch a few key pieces of legislation, one of which is market structure, which basically means how do we regulate the trading of crypto assets. So how do you regulate a Coinbase or a Kraken and things like that? How do you bring assets to market and make them available to retail consumers? I say that because generally speaking, this is broad strokes, but the Republican Party is more open to free markets, a little bit lighter touch regulation, whereas I think the Democratic Party comes with a little bit more of a heavy-handed approach where they'd like a bit more insight into exactly how the company operates. They want to make sure there are plenty of consumer protection measures in place in case something goes wrong. Et cetera. And with there being a Democratic administration right now, you have the Treasury Department and others who are in charge of national security priorities, I think also being very vocal about the threats they see. And so members of the same party in the House and the Senate, those Democrats aligning with the administration and their policy priorities presents an interesting dynamic as well. I think down the line, it will continue to be bipartisan because I don't think it's necessarily a question of like, do you like crypto or not? I think it's like, do you think innovation in the next wave of what to expect in the web space is interesting? Mm-hmm. And I think many people do think it's interesting, but they can't foresee exactly the impact on their constituents right now. I think that's one of the biggest problems we face is that in terms of use cases, it's not like we have a chat GPT yet in crypto where you kind of have this new revolutionary tool that everyone's using. And, you know, if Congress were to like, oh, let's ban it, I think people would not feel comfortable banning chat GPT at this point, where I think there are still members of Congress who would feel comfortable banning crypto. I don't think they fully understand its benefits or its use cases. And until we can kind of fill that educational gap, I think we'll face more of a partisanship, only in that people will be deferring to leadership and others who have already kind of taken a stance on crypto issues. So it's, you know, there are only a handful of, say, 10, 20 members of Congress of all 435 right now that I think really have a deep understanding of the technology. Right. So if you have just the other 400 plus just reading headlines and that's their understanding of the space, it can be a little difficult, I think, to have informed opinions. But I think as it become more mainstream, there'll be more users, more constituents calling about it. I think we'll be in a better place politically.
Yeah, well, I think you struck on a couple of really interesting points there. One is that actually even today, the view from lawmakers and maybe from the general public is, you know, that technology is not all good. You know, there was a time when technology could do no wrong, and now it seems like it can do no right. And even with something like AI, which, to your point, it's like it's clearly, obviously, very useful and powerful, and is probably a thing that we should continue to invest heavily into. There's still a huge backlash against it, right? You know, and with TikTok, like the TikTok ban. Now that's got other dimensions to it, obviously, but there's just this general sort of sense of wariness of the impact of social media on, you know, on our lives, on our society, on our political discourse, on our kids, for those of us who have kids, and you know, these other technologies are part and parcel of this same trend, right? So I do think that in a more general sense, we're fighting a bit of a techlash that this is getting caught up in because you know, it's viewed as bleeding edge and something that you know, could be very disruptive. And I think that probably there needs to be, or at least I hope there's a reset in terms of our consciousness and our thinking around technology in general. We've got a few more minutes. I want to ask one question. So you're overseas right now, and I know that you're an expert in the U.S. situation and not on the global regulatory regime of every country in the world. But there is generally a view that this technology is emerging at a time when the world is much more globalized than it was, say, during like the first era of the internet. You know, in the first era of the internet, all the technology, all the PCs, all the internet connections, all the VC investors, you know, all the universities doing research, not all, but the vast majority of them were in the US, maybe Canada, Switzerland, you know, a couple places. But today is very different. It's a much more globalized world, you know, talent, technology, capital, et cetera, are way more distributed than ever. So, you know, crypto to me is a really interesting litmus test almost, because it is both a financial tech tool and a technology tool, right? So the US has historically been a leader in financial innovation and historically a leader in technology innovation. But now it seems like this maybe could be the first time in a while where they really missed the boat because of sort of regulatory disunity or disorganization, and because other countries are trying to take the lead. What's your take on the global situation in a general sense?
Yeah, it was funny. I was talking with someone last week who's a human rights activist, actually, and she was talking about the difference between a risk tolerant and a no risk system. And I think the United States in particular has really veered towards a no risk system when it comes to financial technology and finance in general after 9/11 and after the 2008 financial crisis. I think because in general, people are on lockdown in terms of preventing anything bad from happening. Like they want assurances that nothing bad is ever going to happen. And I just don't think that's, in my opinion, a way to approach policy. I think there are many benefits that can outweigh risks. And I don't think the calculus right now is being weighed very evenly here in the United States, where I think there are places abroad that are willing to take a little bit more of a risk with a decentralized technology where you don't really have the same oversight you would over the traditional financial system. But there are plenty of benefits that can be seen and gained through that system. And so giving it the space and the energy, the oxygen to kind of breathe and grow is something that I think they're willing to try more than they are here in the United States.
Yeah, and I think also in the U.S., it's the U.S.'s to lose in a sense, right? Like if you look at all these technologies, AI, American universities graduate 15% of top AI researchers, 15, but 50% of top AI researchers live in the U.S. And probably it would be a higher percentage if H-1B visas were more easily available to non-Americans. So the U.S. has got all this other stuff going for it, basically, other than the government. Whereas a lot of other places in the world, the government's, the regulations or the policies in place they can't be just benign. They actually have to be a driver of investment and innovation. And I think we're starting to see that, like in the UK, notwithstanding the fact that there are many of the same issues. The government there said they want to make, or the government in power, they wants the country to be a Web3 capital, which, there's a lot below that that's complicated, but at least that statement is an affirmation of their understanding and interest to make this relevant for the country. And I don't think you see that in the US. And you don't see that, by the way, in Canada. And Canada, where I live, is a country that probably needs it a lot more because we need, Canada's got a lot of great stuff going for it, but it's not the United States. And so it needs to create the conditions to attract investment and to keep founders here. Because if it doesn't, then it might lose out on the next era of the web, right? Sarah, this has been a really great conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. Say hi to Kristen for us and keep up the good work. And we hope to connect with you again soon. Perhaps, I don't know, maybe after the election in the fall for a deep dive on what's next. But that's it for this week's episode of DeFi Decoded. I'm Alex Tapscott. Please make sure to like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you follow it and to check out our newsletter as well. That's it for me. We'll see you next week. Thanks.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not residents in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.